people, my name is Nicole and today I have my January wrap up for you guys. So this month was a pretty good reading month. It wasn't phenomenal, but you know, it wasn't bad considering I was starting classes and all that chaos of the school basically. So let's just jump right in. The first book I read this year was The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second book in the Mistborn series and I loved this. Seriously, Brandon Sanderson is one of my all-time favorite fantasy writers. He is pretty much the king of high fantasy in my mind. His worlds are so extensive and completely immersive, and for a like almost 800-page book, seriously, this thing is huge. It kind of just flew by. I mean, it took me a while to read it, I'm not gonna lie, but it's the kind of thing that once you get into it, once you actually dedicate some time to it, it just kind of flies by. All the characters are interesting and complex people, lots of gray morality, no really black or white, right or wrong. There's so much complex like magic and mystery going on in here. We found out a lot of new information about the world and how the magic works within this world in this book, but honestly I think we got more questions than answers, hopefully some of which will be answered in the next book in the series. I did have a little bit of a hard time remembering who was who when it came to the sort of main cast of characters. That's partially my fault for waiting so long between books. It took me forever to read the first book, so I was kind of intimidated to start this book. But in general, I loved this book. I loved this series. I love the characters. I love the magic. I love the world. Pretty much almost everything about it is just wonderful, so I gave it 5 stars. Then I read I Wrote This For You by Ian S. Thomas, and this is a poetry collection that's like kind of half poetry, half photographs, and I really liked this. I thought that a couple of times it got maybe a little cheesy, but I like the pairing of the photographs and the poems. I read the sort of sequel to this, like the companion piece to this, which is I Wrote This For You and Only You, and I really like that one as well. I feel like I never really know what to say when reviewing poetry, just because I don't have really that much experience reading poetry to like really know the detailed like nuances of like what's good. I just know what I like, and I really like most of the poems in this. Like I said, a couple of times felt a little cliche. There are a few poems in this that were just kind of like, whatever, that I just sort of skimmed through. But there were a number of them that really stuck out to me, really, I feel like, impacted me, which is generally my measure of how good poetry is. It's whether or not it impacts me. So I gave this 4 stars. Then I read City of Saints and Thieves by Natalie Anderson, and this I actually have a full-length non-spoiler review for it, so I will link that in the doobly-doo so you can check that out for my extended thoughts. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I thought that the setting was really interesting. It's set in Kenya, which is not a setting I'm particularly accustomed to. So it was really cool learning about this new place, and I felt like the story was this really interesting mystery. It was very action-packed with characters who were unique and compelling and made me want to hang out with them, even though they're in the middle of all this craziness with like a murder mystery going on. I still wanted to be their friend, so I feel like that's pretty much a mark of success. So I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read Beast by Bree Spangler, and I had kind of mixed feelings about this. I wasn't really a huge fan of the main character. I felt like he was very just consistently self-pitying and didn't really make any improvements over the course of the book. Not that I'm saying that by the end of the book he has to have completely, you know, pulled a 180 and love himself and everything's hunky-dory. It just felt like there was no character development with him, but he was kind of a jerk to a lot of the people who were close to them. And I mean, like, a number of the other characters in this book aren't necessarily like perfect people. His best friend in the book was a total asshole. The way that the main character interacted with him, half the time I was frustrated with him for not standing up for himself. Half the time he just went too far. I'm not sure how much of it was just him being a, I don't know, impulsive teenager or whatever, but I just found it really frustrating. I did really like Jamie, who is the love interest in this book, and she's honestly one of the reasons I originally picked up this book. It's sort of a queer Beauty and the Beast retelling. It's not really that much of a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but it's being marketed as that. Basically, Jamie's trans and she's the beauty in the situation, the Beast being the main character because he has lots of self-esteem issues, because he's like really physically large and hairy. Anyway, beside the point, Jamie's trans and she's amazing. She's funny and she's clever and she's smart and she's creative and a photographer, and I felt like she was always doing a really good job of simultaneously standing up for herself and pointing out that she shouldn't have to always stand up for herself, but that she would rather like be able to protect herself than have everyone else always like crowding around her and like trying to be super protective of her. She's like, no, I can defend myself. I shouldn't have to defend myself, but I can. I don't know, she was just great, and honestly I think she deserved so much better than the main character. Honestly, Jamie saved this book for me. So I gave this book 2.5 stars. I thought the writing style was good, but like I said, I just couldn't stand most of the characters. Then I read Queer: A Graphic History by Meg John Barker, and this is awesome. If you are at all interested in queer theory, I highly recommend picking this up. It is basically an overview of the history of queer theory, some of the major theorists, the major ideas, also some criticisms and like where we're going next kind of thing. I personally am a gender and queer studies minor, so this is what I've been studying for the past year and a half, and out of all the queer theory classes I've taken, this touched on almost every single idea that we talked about. This one little book, like it's not very big, at least mentioned almost every single big idea, which was really impressive. Also, if you are someone who finds Butler and Foucault confusing, if you're someone who's ever like glanced at queer theory, you probably are one of those people, because Butler and Foucault are very confusing and complex, and that's kind of what they're known for. Brilliant, but very confusing. This managed to explain them more clearly and concisely than, like I said, a year and a half of classes talking about them did. So, if you're interested in queer theory, highly, highly, highly recommend this. There's illustrations all throughout that help explain things. Sometimes they're there just for decorative sake, sometimes they are there as sort of diagrams and helping with the explaining, and I feel like they help sort of break up all the really dense theory, because queer theory readings can get very dense and just like a lot to take in. This doesn't go super in detail to a lot of things, it really is an overview and an introduction, but if you're interested in queer theory, I think this is a phenomenal book to pick up. I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read History Is All You Left Me by Adam Silvera, and wow, okay. So this was probably the book that I was most excited to read. I was about to say all month, but probably it's up there for one of the books I'm most excited to read all year. I absolutely loved Adam Silvera's first novel, and so getting my hands on this was kind of one of my top priorities. I'm not sure if I read it at the perfect time or at the worst time, because I read it on a day where I was already super emotional because of like other school related stuff. I was like on the verge of a panic attack and I was like already crying. I'm fine now, don't worry, everything's all good and taken care of. But I was already kind of an emotional mess, and then I started reading this, and this is very emotional. It's a very emotional book. It's an Adam Silvera book. Adam Silvera is the master of knowing exactly which buttons to push to make you sob, and sob I did. So I'm not sure if it was good for my mental state to like be reading something that made me even more emotional, or bad. At the end of the day, I felt great because it was like super, super cathartic. But it was a very intense emotional experience. But despite all the tears and emotions that I experienced while reading this, I absolutely loved it. The characters were all interesting and complicated and felt like real fleshed out people. Even characters who we only saw for like one scene were complex and different. Like I said, real people who weren't just one-dimensional plot devices. It was fantastic. Main characters were interesting. It felt like there wasn't really any antagonists in the story. Everyone was just kind of in it together all morning. Theo, it is impossible not to fall in love with Theo while reading this. And yet he wasn't perfect. We fell in love with an imperfect person. Theo was obviously a wonderful person. Otherwise, everyone in this book wouldn't be in love with him. But he's flawed in good ways that feel really honest, and I love him so much. Also, A+ bi representation. There are multiple bisexual characters, multiple gay characters, just A+ representation. Seriously, it's amazing. I just love everything Adam Silvera does, and I don't know what to say about this. I was thinking of doing a full-length review, but I felt like the entire thing would just be me like crying and being like, I don't know what to say about this, it's so perfect. Cause like, it's so perfect. I don't think I had a single issue with the entire book. It was just amazing, so I gave it 5 stars. Then I read Said the Shotgun to the Head by Saul Williams, and this is one poem. It's kind of a long poem, but it's really kind of cool, formatted in a cool way, and so it jumps around in like vibe a lot. Basically, this poem is set up with the structure of being a love poem, but within that, Saul Williams explores, you know, gun violence and religion and racism and cultural appropriation and politics and war, and he just touches on so many different important topics, but it never felt preachy, it never felt overdone, it never felt like too much. I mean, it was a lot, don't get me wrong, but it all made sense in context. I particularly found his discussions of God to be really interesting. I'm not a religious person, but I think some of the thoughts he had and the way he talked about God was just really, really interesting. I just thought this was phenomenal. I don't think I've read anything like it. I didn't really understand a lot of it. Some of it just kind of went over my head because, like I said, it was a lot and very kind of an intense reading experience, but I did really like it. I gave it 4 stars. And the last book I read this month was The Storied Life of A.J. Sicari by Gabrielle Zevin, and I feel like the best word to describe this book is charming. It was charming. I don't think it like is one of those books that will change my life and like I'll be thinking about it every single day until the day I die, but I did really like it. I mean, I really love reading books about books and the people who love books. And so this kind of just felt really like warm and cozy because pretty much the entire thing takes place in a bookstore. And one of the interesting things is, so it's called Storied Life of A.J. Sicari. You follow this man, A.J. Sicari, throughout his life. While it felt like kind of a slice of life kind of story, like there was a story before this and there will be a story after this, it didn't feel so much like a slice of Sicari's life. It felt more like a slice of life in the life of the bookstore that he owns, it was just really interesting because obviously, like I said, the story focuses on him, but it felt like it was about the bookstore. I don't know. It's weird, but really good. I liked that Sicari was clearly not intended to be one of those characters that you like all the time. There were a lot of times where he was kind of an asshole and kind of pretentious. I definitely do not agree with a lot of his thoughts on what makes a good book, and I would be kind of offended by his thoughts on YA if I didn't know that Gabrielle Zevin writes mostly YA, but it was clearly a very intentional he's being a jerk here kind of moments. So it didn't bother me that much. I liked that he was a complex character who wasn't just the hero of our story. And Maya was kind of just a joy to read about. She is the little baby that A.J. Sicari finds in the store one day that kind of just changes his life. She was such a smart kid and watching her grow up was awesome. So I really liked this book. Like I said, it's not like the most incredible book I've ever read, but I do think it's well worth reading, especially if you're someone who just loves books as like an aesthetic. Obviously, like if you're watching booktube, you love books, but I'm talking less about like, oh, I like reading, and more just like loving the idea of books and the aesthetic of books. If that makes any sense. I don't know if it does. It makes sense to me. Anyway, I gave this book 4 stars. Alright, so those are all the books I read this month. Let me know what your thoughts on any of them are in the comments. I love you, and I will see you later.